You are listening to In Pursuit of Development with Dan Bannock.
Much of the conversation on artificial intelligence these days is dominated by what we fear, such as deepfakes, disinformation, and the erosion of trust. But there's also another story that deserves more attention: AI as a force multiplier for development. AI that helps us learn faster, make better informed decisions, reduce waste in time, funding, and effort, detect emerging risks earlier, and target interventions more precisely where they will have the greatest impact. This is particularly important because global development does not necessarily face an evidence shortage problem. Rather, it often faces an evidence usability challenge. For decades, donors, governments, and civil society organizations have produced mountains of evaluations and so-called lessons learned. However, that knowledge has often ended up scattered across unsearchable databases, buried in PDF files, or lost when staff and organizational priorities change. Although it has now become fashionable to highlight the importance of evidence-based decision-making, in reality, decisions continue to be made under pressure with incomplete information and very human shortcuts. So what would it look like to treat all that accumulated experience as a living resource? What if we could connect patterns across thousands of projects while still keeping context, nuance, and local meaning intact? My guest is Lindsey Moore, CEO and founder of Developmetrics, a women-owned technology social business committed to driving social impact and promoting equity worldwide. Lindsey brings the perspective of someone who, before she founded Developmetrics, spent years inside the system with more than a decade as an economist at USAID. One example of how AI and predictive analytics can support evidence-based decisions comes from Lindsey's recent work on land use policy. She and her team used a human-centered and fine-tuned language model which was trained on tens of thousands of expert-coded excerpts from USAID agricultural evaluations. The model can quickly identify and classify real interventions from water management to property rights. That helps policymakers cut through information overload without losing context. Thus, with a clear taxonomy and carefully labeled evidence, AI can turn decades of buried documentation into usable insight that is faster and cheaper than manual review. Another example is how Developmetrics used a domain-trained model to preserve learning from USAID after its closure. They turned decades of evaluations into structured and searchable evidence. What emerges are clearer patterns in what tends to work across settings. It is AI as institutional memory, strengthening judgment rather than substituting for it. In our conversation, Lindsey and I explored the practical and ethical questions of building AI for development. How can we best make development knowledge usable? Not just as a tool that sounds intelligent, but a system that reads evidence carefully, organizes it transparently, and helps practitioners find what is most relevant. And then there are the questions about who defines the categories, whose perspectives are missing, and how we can build AI that supports better decisions without reproducing old power imbalances in new digital form. The response to Season 6 has been fantastic, with thousands of listeners tuning in from around the world. The show has also been a regular presence in the top 100 science charts on Apple Podcasts in the United States and across several other countries. To help me reach even more listeners, please follow and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast platform. And if you enjoy the episode, I'd be very grateful if you could share it on social media and help spread the word. This is Dan Bannock, and you are listening to In Pursuit of Development. Lindsey, wonderful to see you. And thank you so much for accepting my invitation at short notice. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So, Lindsey, there's so much talk these days about all the negative stuff with the AI. We are worried about how disinformation, misinformation, fake news, all of these aspects that AI is facilitating is going to weaken democracy. And I'm a political scientist. I've been writing about it. But there's also the other side of AI that I feel sometimes doesn't get enough attention, which is the positive side, how AI can be a force multiplier. It can actually be, a force of good. And so I want to start there, Lindsey. If you were to describe AI for global development, I've read in your work that it hasn't really been used that much yet. But tell us about all the possibilities that AI offers in this pursuit of development.
Yeah, sure. I love that premise. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the possibilities are endless. And you're right. AI in international development has not scaled yet. I mean, if you look at the philanthropy sector, I think they were much quicker to make some big investments in AI, many of which backfired actually in a lot of ways. Whereas we see the development sector really thought about it for a long time, and it honestly is still thinking about it. USAID was really the first to move forward with this kind of thinking, and now we're seeing kind of the German government, FCDO, NORAD moving forward. But the development sector really has to think a lot before they jump into these technologies, because it's not always about efficiency and saving money as it is in other sectors. It's really about saving lives. And so I think there's been a lot more thinking than acting, but we're starting to see some movement. And so what does that movement really mean? What potential could it hold? The thing I'm most excited about is just that, there's been so much incredible knowledge created in the development sector, so much reports. I mean, when I worked at USAID, I was an economist at USAID for over 11 years in the Foreign Service. I would spend days in the field talking to farmers about, their irrigation ditches, and they would be expecting, that conversation to yield some results. And I would write it in a report, and then no one would ever read it. Not even my mother would would read these reports. And so there's all this knowledge out there that hasn't been connected. And now with AI, we can just light up all that knowledge by connecting it together. So I think, the past is really focused on RTCs, evidence, how do we build it? And that work has been great, but it hasn't been used. The World Bank says that, I think they say about 60% of their reports are not even ever downloaded. So, we don't have an evidence shortage. We have an evidence usability problem. And so now we have the ability with AI to build this, to turn this evidence into something that's really usable. And I think that's what's so exciting, because we have less money than ever in the sector, but so we have to use it more effectively. And I think it provides that opportunity.
Well, a lot of what you're saying actually applies to many of our fields. I mean, I'm thinking about academia. We produce articles and books, and you keep wondering, apart from the citation index, who actually reads. I was talking to Pedro Conceição from the Human Development Office, and he was, telling me about how his office tracks the number of times the Human Development Report is downloaded and cited. So everybody wants to, of course, make sure that whatever evidence they produce, whatever lessons are learned, are used effectively. But in our field, and so there's a lot of evidence that is being generated all the time. But I suppose sometimes we are bombarded with too much evidence. We can't tackle this information overload, right? I'm thinking that is where these large language models, the LLMs, right? They help out in trying to synthesize, make sense. And I'm thinking it could be in relation to health. It could be in relation to, education or social cash transfers, or just decision making. I mean, I think that is, for me, at least from a political science perspective, if I was a decision maker and I had all of this evidence somehow systematized, perhaps I would be better able to make more informed decisions. Is that how you think also?
I mean, that's exactly right. And that's where there's both the opportunity and the challenge, and where we get a lot of the pushback from organizations. It's not just any AI, right? You can't take GPT and slap it on data from, women in Ghana and ask, how do we better empower these women in Ghana, right? Because every model is an opinion. It has an underlying data training set, which is mostly all the internet. data, which is a Western male perspective, and the algorithms are also mostly Western male produced, right? And so yes, it can do that. It definitely can do that. But the how is really, really important. And I think this is where I really hope to see the development sector kind of put their flag in the ground and say, we're going to create our own models and we're going to work with the local communities. So when we ask these women, what does empowerment mean to you? It's not the narrative of a Western male, but it's the narrative of the women in those communities. And same with the development sector, at USAID, we fine-tuned very carefully, what does resilience mean? We spent months saying, what does resilience mean? Is this resilience? Hand labeling that data and then using that to teach the algorithm. And, even at USA, different offices had different opinions. So for example, one office thought that agriculture, a fairly obvious definition, included livestock, and another office didn't. So if you say, what agriculture projects have we done? They would have different answers. And so every definition has to be thought through, and who is behind that definition. And so that's where I think the opportunity is to actually really bring in these perspectives, bring in this incredible technical expertise that exists out there. And also, it's a huge opportunity to include all the technical experts who have done so much thinking on every single perspective and really bring these voices into the conversation. So yes, if we can do that, then it would be an incredible opportunity. And I think that's where we get the debate often in between those two poles.
So it's not just about the large data sets, our ability to efficiently scour through these data sets, but to make them actually more accurate. It's to reduce these misinterpretations, but that requires training. That requires humans coding these data sets, if I understand correctly.
Yeah.
And that is time consuming, right? So to strive for efficiency, you have to actually put in the hard yards first.
You do, I always tell people that AI is just like basic research methods. You have a research question, then you have to think of what's the data that's going to answer this question? What's the framework that we're using? AI is no different. And that's why I keep telling people it's not going to, if you're a technical expert, you're not going to lose your job if you can bring in your frameworks, your rigor, your thinking, your data sets, because that's how it should be treated, like academic models. Granted, if you just want to ask a broad question, what projects have we done in Kenya? Sure, you don't need to understand what's a project, what's Kenya. So Copilot, any of those tools are very good for generalized information. these models have been trained on trillions of parameters. More and more parameters keep coming in so that they can get these incredible answers that sound so good, and it has its place. But if we're going to ask technical questions, we need technical thinking behind it. So it's like giving yourself 200 PhD students to help you understand the evidence faster, and you can still guide that thinking.
That sounds ideal. I would love to do that.
But the hand labeling is time consuming. That's true.
Yeah.
And I don't see a way around it, honestly.
I'm also curious about what you just said. Think about development that has been done in our parts of the world, the aid industry for the last 50, 60 years. A lot of the reports and evaluations that have been produced, there may have been certain very Western perspectives. Not there has been. You mentioned the male perspective, the global North perspective. It could be an arrogant, patronizing perspective. A lot of advice and preaching, which may also have implications for evaluations, the way in which these were done. How do you correct for that, Lindsey? How do you introduce a more female global South perspective in all of this?
I love that question. And I wish more people were asking that exact question, because I don't hear it really, honestly, being asked. But it's true. Evaluations are biased, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't understand them. We should still analyze them. What we saw with USAID data is that one evaluation would have these lessons and recommendations, and then the follow-on would have the same lessons and recommendations. We see that as a pattern. So the same kind of project throughout 60 years, we see these same lessons and recommendations. So yes, there's bias in there for sure, but there is also some incredibly useful information. And because we have such a huge amount of qualitative data, you can almost analyze it like qualitative, like with so much qualitative data, you can almost analyze it like quantitative. You have so many excerpts that over time you can look at these patterns and understand kind of what it's saying, but you have to read it in the context with which it's in. And that's the problem with these large language models. Often the citations are wrong and you can't really understand what is the context. So if you are looking at evaluations, you can go into it thinking, yes, okay, but this is obviously has some bias. What other data sets can we add? Or if we're doing a project, there was one project we started with USAID in Papua New Guinea. Unfortunately, we weren't able to finish it because, well, of course, USAID doesn't exist anymore, sadly. But, we used the algorithm that we at Developmetrics built for USAID, and we asked, how do we, help work on gender-based violence in Papua New Guinea? And of course, it came out with the answer based on all of USAID evaluations. But then we brought in testimonials from the local communities there of women, just kind of transcripts of conversation. And then the recommended outcome changed completely. It said that we should work on sorcery accusation. So sorcery, being accused of being a witch, was the number one cause of gender-based violence for this community. So, and that would have never been picked up in, a different algorithm. So we have to source local data, which again is back to basic research methods that we need to bring in. And there should be more donor support, or any donor support, any support for this type of making sure that we don't whitewash the narrative out there with just a few voices.
A colleague of mine, Johanna Adolfsson, and I, together with an African colleague, we recently wrote a piece on the role of witchcraft and political decision making. And much of the data was from Malawi. And the argument is something that a lot of Western donors are not very comfortable with, you see, because we can, from a Western perspective, emphasize good governance, transparency, sharing of information, accountability. But in reality, in many societies, in Asia, in Africa, even in some parts of our world here in the North, there is suspicion. People are distrustful. And because people are afraid of being bewitched, they don't wish to be transparent. They don't want to share any form of information. And this is something that plays out rather openly. But our impression, at least in that study, was that a lot of Western actors are very uncomfortable, don't want to talk about it. But to return to USAID, Lindsey, so one of my favorite recurring themes this season has been the dismantling of USAID. And I've had a lot of people, including the former chief economist, talking about it. And I know that you worked in USAID. Before we talk about what your company does and how you use AI, how was it for you to be an economist in Bangladesh? I mean, what was it that was working and what wasn't? I read somewhere you wrote that sometimes you had to change or make decisions at very, short notice. And one of the things I think that motivated you to work in this field is that there just wasn't enough information to make these decisions correctly and quickly. So help us understand, how was it in Bangladesh or in many of the other countries that you were working in?
Yeah, I mean, Bangladesh was my first post. I came right out of LSE and was a country economist for Bangladesh. So I had a perception of what I would be doing. And then, of course, when you start a job, I think you get disabused of those perceptions often quite quickly. And yeah, sometimes you just get a rush of money coming in. And I think one thing that maybe is missing in the narrative, a lot of kind of the dismantling of USAID, is that, and what I learned the hard way is that, yes, the intentions of USAID were to help people around the world solve some of the most intractable challenges. But more than that, it was the soft arm of the US government. It was the soft power. And the carrot works very well sometimes, right? So sometimes, a government would get its aid, certain money taken away as a tool by the US government. And that would end up on my lap to program in a country that was like Bangladesh, or, the Dominican Republic where I worked, or other countries. And so I don't know, that's a little bit outside the AI conversation, but just to say that aid has a soft power component that I think people in aid don't want to talk about, because that's not why they join. They join because they want to help people, but it is part of it. And so, yes, when you have to program money quickly, you realize how this whole narrative of evidence-based decision-making gets thrown out the window so quickly, because you just have to get the money out the door.
It could be December, right? It's Christmas around the corner and a
Exactly.
new financial year starting. You have to get the money out.
Yeah, and when I was first, posted in Bangladesh, I expected that, there were people higher up than me that were understood exactly what was happening and checking what I was doing, and but as you get higher and higher, you see you have less and less time, and it gets less, and it's not because people don't want to use the evidence or they're not intelligent. It's just because it's humanly impossible to go through everything.
So what do you then do? What kind of metrics do you use to make these decisions? Or what did you find that worked best for you?
Well, I think a lot of people find that the findings of our algorithms, actually, they already know it. So I think trusted people who have worked in the field for a long time, they have their own kind of internal understanding from talking to people, from experience, that they generally rely on intuition that often we find with the AI validates that same intuition. So they're never like, oh, wow, we should bring delivery closer to households. What an incredible realization for them. They're like, yes, obviously I did this project and I realized it. But the problem is that you don't often know where those people are, they leave. And so you don't have kind of a centralized institutional knowledge where those people exist. So, sometimes I would just guess. And just to be totally honest, and you read horror stories in aid of people who guessed on microfinance, and then farmers who ended up killing themselves in India, or so it's scary, and that is why I left USAID to start Develop Metrics, to try to solve that.
One of your early clients was USAID. And what I find fascinating reading in this piece, and I'll put it in the show notes, which was published recently in Stanford's Social Innovation Review, when USAID shut down, its lessons nearly vanished, AI helped recover them. That was the title. Now, it turns out that USAID had been spending billions, was it 30 billion in impact evaluations over the last, I don't know how many decades, right?
Not just impact, less impact, honestly.
Okay.
There are fewer impact, just overall evaluations, midterm and line, but also some impact. Yeah.
So I don't know,
years.
thousands or billions or millions of pages of or
Yeah.
PDF files, a
Yeah.
lot of them, right? Some
And
of them were.
digitized. So we had typewritten ones from the 60s. I mean, USA did an incredible job of digitizing what they could find.
So what was it that you were asked to do a few years ago? This is before USAID was dismantled. Was it to sort of systematize this evidence, or to make this more up and running for current use and using the latest technology?
Yeah, we started in 2021, just exactly helping to solve exactly that question that I was asking. What should we do? Well, honestly, we started with what do we do? So USA didn't even know what are all the outcomes that we've tried to achieve? What are all the interventions that we've used to achieve those? Just having that taxonomy, to use, a really boring word that I've become incredibly passionate about. But taxonomy, what do we do and how is it defined? That's kind of the foundation, which became the knowledge graph of their algorithm, which is, everything we've done. First, you have to understand what you've done in order to then populate it with the evidence and then look at the results. So that's really where we started, is just figuring out what is it that they've done. Our first question was, what's every digital intervention we've ever done in Africa? Sponsored by the Africa Bureau. They just want to know, what have they done? And so we used large language models, very nascent back then, to actually go through it all and look at everything that they've done. And from that, they were eventually able to use that evidence to respond to congressional taskers. So, Congress is always messaging you saying, what did you do with identity verification in Malawi? And you have to say, oh, shoot. You have to call the Malawi mission. You have to look through documents manually. But so instead of doing that whole exercise, they were able to reduce that time and save, I think, thousands and thousands of staff time. And so that's how we started.
And all of this was because AI was at that time getting a lot of attention, and people somewhere up in the system thought this is about time we used AI to systematize the evidence, or was it just accidental?
They didn't know. I mean, large language models weren't even a household name by then. I mean, GPT, was definitely operating, but they hadn't released their chat yet. So actually, USAID did not allow large language models to be. They made a ban against it completely. So we started before. Actually, we went under investigation by the General Counsel of USAID
Really?
3 or 4 years later because we had been using it for so long that when they came out and finally made a policy against it, we had already been implementing it for so long. Which then from that, USAID agreed to sponsor our FedRAMP certification, which is a certification which allows you to go through all the evidence using AI as a technology kind of certification because they saw the value of money and time saved. But so at the beginning, no, they didn't understand it. Artificial intelligence was still kind of a crazy idea. I had a PowerPoint with like a big tornado graphic that was like algorithm, and then your evidence. I would peddle that around trying to explain it, and people, I think people thought I was crazy, but they saw how quickly they could get to the evidence, and so that's at the end what convinced them.
But help my listeners understand, Lindsey, the difference between a large language model LLM and a development evidence LLM. Is that what you call it? DELLM?
The development evidence large language.
So how do you go about constructing the DELLM?
Yeah, so what we do is we separate understanding from generation. So we create a specialist model that reads and structures evidence, and then a generative model writes it, so grounded in what was already retrieved. So you can always kind of think of it as like a librarian and a policy drafter. So the librarian finds the best passages and labels them based on this taxonomy that you've created with the specialist. And then the drafter writes a synthesis using only what the librarian kind of already surfaced. So, I mean, from a methodological perspective, we fine tune an encoder to do a high precision reading. So it extracts and it tags enriched excerpts.
So did you go through all of these millions and millions of pages of text?
Yeah.
And that took years.
Oh, yeah, about 4 years. Of hand labeling text with experts from so many different universities. We started with USAID, but then every time we worked with an organization, we would label more, and we're still doing that. I mean, we're still, when you use kind of these generalized LLMs, you get good sounding answers, but they're hollow. They have this kind of missing. And the only way you can do that is by hand labeling and really tuning it to what people think. So every time we get an answer that someone doesn't like, we say, okay, why? Okay, it's not understanding this term. Okay, who knows this term? Let's label the data. And every time we have to label less and less data as our archive gets bigger and bigger.
I would be really worried to take on such an ambitious task.
Well, we did it before AI was popular, and this was how basic research was done. People using deduce or NVIDIA going through hand labeling text. I mean, so we weren't in the whole AI rush that happened. And it's still to this date, the only way I know to actually get real meaning is bringing people to do this hard work of interpreting it. Otherwise, you're relying on an interpretation which you can't verify.
And who would have thought 4 years ago that we'd be sitting here talking about the demise of USAID and all of these lessons that were learned? So, I mean, in hindsight, that was a very clever decision on whoever's part to initiate this. So let's cut to the chase and tell our listeners the main conclusions you arrived at in this exercise, Lindsey. I read about 5 overarching lessons learned, and I'm sure my listeners would be very intrigued. So could we briefly discuss some of these lessons?
Yeah, I mean, the first one was just bringing delivery closer to households. So we found that programs really perform best when the decisions, kind of the follow-ups and the problem solving happen where people actually live. So, the farm, the school, the clinic, and not in an air-conditioned, meeting room 100 miles away. And it sounds kind of obvious, but that's how development works. I mean, I spent most of my time in country in an air-conditioned embassy conference room.
Right. And this is an important point. It's not always happening from Washington or Oslo. It's also from the capital cities within a fortress of an embassy building.
Exactly. And, there was always the suggesting go out into the quote unquote field, go meet people, but then there was never the budget for it, especially in Bangladesh. When I was there was cartels. It became very politically unstable. We could only operate in, armored vehicles to get around. So how are you going to go into the field? How are you going to go into schools when you're in this type of situation? And so all the decisions were really made from these air-conditioned office buildings or armored vehicles. And there was always this tension between actually getting into talking to people. Even though there was that overall desire and encouragement, it rarely happened. So that was really a key. Sometimes these things, but actually implementing them are much harder.
So that was the first, that bring delivery closer to households. I found that the second one also super interesting. Practice changes practice.
Yeah.
And what I was thinking about there was, and there's been this polarized debate, Lindsey, I'm sure you know, in many parts of the world where a lot of workshops and training sessions are advocated by northern donors for capacity building, for training purposes, etc. But it often turns out to be more interesting for participants to get a per diem, the daily allowances. And a lot of the lessons are forgotten. So I'm super excited that you identified this also to be a lesson.
It came up again and again. And, I experienced it myself as a USAID employee. Whenever there was a problem or, train people, that was always the answer. And, it's in a way, it's a very hopeful outlook. Oh, it's the problem is just that they don't understand. We just need to tell them, so constant training. And one of the most frequent metrics that we saw was number of people trained.
Yes.
In order to judge the success of a project. But we all know, we've all sit through some of these trainings, and you just mostly look forward to the coffee breaks. And often the most valuable parts of these trainings are the meeting of the people, going back to the first lesson, than the actual, PowerPoint lecture that is being given on stage. So we found that the behavior change really only happens when skills are practiced in the real world and reinforced by peers and kind of this more hands-on learning, and that really a lot of these trainings and the money going to these trainings are wasted.
And I want to add something to this, something that I've been telling some of the aid agencies in recent consultations with them, that danger that when you invite people for training, you're actually taking them away from their offices, from whatever they were doing. And Malawi, a country I know rather well, you sometimes have an entirely empty office because everybody is attending some workshop. Now, there's another justification for this because, at least from the bureaucratic perspective, they say we get such a low salary. This is our way of topping up.
Mm-hmm.
So the jury, I think, is still out. I'm really intrigued. I'd like to know more about this. We could continue the conversation as to, when do these trainings actually work? And when is it just more performative and, just filling in the blanks and writing, how many people showed up.
Yeah, I mean, and getting to travel, right? Like sometimes our trainings were held in Bangkok, so that was great. Who wouldn't want to leave Dhaka to go to Bangkok? I mean, so yeah.
Okay,
definitely.
So then the third one, design for scale, not for pilots.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I love pilots. Everyone always talks about pilotitis or pilots have a bad rap these days, and I don't think pilots in themselves are a bad thing actually in any way. It's really just that it's really the intention behind them. So like if they're neat, they're fundable, small enough to photograph, that's kind of what people go for, is just have a glossy write-up on them, when really they need to be designed for scale, meaning they need to have owners of them who are going to be there after the pilot. They have to have budgets or an idea of how a budget is going to occur. And they have to have kind of an operational efficiency, just like anything else, right? Just regular business logic needs to be built in. But often it's not the pilot that's the problem. It's the thinking of it that's the problem within such a small time frame.
I found this rather intriguing because, I'm thinking of solutions that we don't always know the evidence of beforehand. I mean, we can't be sure this is going to work. So I suppose that is the reason for having smaller pilots. If it works, then you could scale them up once the evidence has been collected. But you feel that some of these pilots just disappear, that they never really materialize.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay, and then fourth, co-creation beats consultation. Consultation is one of those buzzwords in development. We have to consult, and it is important, right? It shows respect. It's about dignity. It's not about somebody coming and preaching and being arrogant. So consultation is important, but consultation can also be a bit one-sided, that you ask people and then you go home and you do whatever you were going to do in the first place.
Exactly. Stakeholder consultation, right? That's the key word. And it's a box you have to check. Actually, we had to check. Yes, checked. Stakeholders mapped and consulted. Done. Now let's move on. you know, whereas it's really about sharing authority and actually the writing and really partnering in a meaningful way that works rather than just this consultation. So and that's something that USAID really tried to move towards with locally led development and with this idea of co-creation, and that was really starting to materialize. And I think there were a lot of good examples of how that was starting to show up. So I did see that shift occurring, but you have to give up power. And going back, to the theme of power, that's not something that everyone always wants to do.
Yeah, I was thinking about, the importance of personalities here. I mean, there are some people who are know-it-all, come there and they think they have the solutions and maybe highly disrespectful, or they may consult without really listening. So I've had a lot of people on the show saying, our voices are silent. We are not consulted, or when we are asked for something, people just ignore them, even though they wanted our views in the first place. So I suppose the role of personalities, I mean, if you and I like each other, we could co-create something, but personal chemistry, I'm sure, matters for co-creation, don't you think?
It does. I think personal chemistry matters a lot, but I also think, the ability to let go
You
matters a
mean
lot.
just not insist on your own beliefs?
Well, for example, letting communities monitor their own projects. Why does it always have to be an outside person coming in with their clipboard to monitor it? Can communities monitor it and hold each other responsible? That's what we saw as a lesson that worked much better than having an outsider. So giving up, a lot of these practices are in place because at the end of the day, it's US taxpayer money and it needs to be protected and make sure that it doesn't, result in the way that we wouldn't want it to. So there's a balance to be struck there. But I think right now the balance at the time was shifted way more towards the controls, having to control everything, and not necessarily really co-creating in a way that shifts power to communities.
And then the final lesson, strengthen the middle layer. Tell us a bit about that. Not just the highest officials or the low level officials, the middle.
Yeah, I mean, people kind of a theme that keeps coming up is there's the headlines that people love to make big headlines, but it's often the quieter, smaller work that doesn't get so much notice. This middle layer of teachers and nurses and agronomists and cooperative leaders, these really passionate people who are responsible for daily implementation. And that's kind of where the policy actually meets the public. And if you ignore that layer, then we find that reforms collapse, because those, I mean, you can think about it also from a government perspective. We see this a lot in governments. Governments change. Well, maybe not in this current case, but normally governments change, but the layer of people who are actually doing the work stay. So you have some sense that, okay, these reforms, the policies are still going to be upheld. Those kind of middle layer people are still there, supervising things. And so they need to be supported. That's what really is the core. Everything else is just kind of theory on top of that.
I remember when I was a young researcher, I would often think that going to the top official, the principal secretary, or the head bureaucrat, would be the most important thing. It turned out, and it still turns out, that it's important to talk to them to get permission to be able to consult and talk to their juniors. But they know very little. They sit at a higher level. So it's just a waste of time, really. Well, not always, but most often. So it is the middle layer. Did you find anything on corruption, on misuse of funds? Because that is something that aid agencies are always really worried about.
Hmm. In evaluations, like we talk about, they're not really there. That is a fascinating question. That would be in a different database in the audits. that the OIG, well, when it was functioning, would do. And that's where the that type of information would really, really be revealed. So that's a fascinating, maybe follow-up thing to think about, is look at that data source and look at corruption. But I think if you look at it, it happens a lot less. Yes, it happens for sure. I saw it myself, but it happens a lot less in a lot lower levels than.
And whenever it happens, it gets a lot of sensational coverage, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so now you've done this evidence scanning, and you've made these categories, these conclusions. How do you think all of this is going to help the US now that USAID doesn't exist? Who's taking all of these lessons forward? And this goes to my final sort of set of issues or questions for you, Lindsey. What is it that organizations should be doing more of? But let's start with the Americans, and in going back to what we started, the loss of soft power. I can't tell you how frustrated I am that if you had so much soft power and you're giving it up, as the US has, it's just mind boggling. So now you have all of this lovely, very detailed knowledge about all the evaluations that were funded so very generously by the US government. How can this be used? Or is it going to be philanthropies? Are there smaller organizations that could benefit? Who's actually using this information?
Well, I mean, that's the exact question, right? And I think that's the next frontier of knowledge in general. Yes, we know it. We've created the knowledge. I've written another report. Like, great. Thanks for turning into a podcast. Maybe that will help other people think about it, but it's just another report, right? That's going into another database. And so how do we actually use evidence? That's what we're studying. Actually, we, as you mentioned, we got funded by FCDO to study this exact thing. How can we actually, and I believe AI can do it. It might not be the chatbot or the dashboard, but how can we actually integrate this into real workflows? And that's what needs to be studied next. We don't need another RCT methodology or another, whatever. We need to actually figure out in practice. Just because you build it doesn't mean they will come, right? Just because you write it doesn't mean they're going to read it. And just because you build a beautiful dashboard and even a chatbot doesn't mean it's going to work. There's still a very, very, very human element in this that needs to be explored further. So that's our core research now into that, because I really don't have the answer for that.
Technology and AI is proceeding at such a fast pace, Lindsey. Every day there's something new coming up. If you were to, in conclusion, reflect on the way forward using AI for global development, I'm a big fan of all these apps that could be used to detect anemia in villages. There's something called Ruby or snake bites, how to treat that. I love these real world, or even for education, the Kwame apps or the Kwanda apps. All of these are super, super relevant. But if you were to zoom out and think about AI and global development in the next 6 months, in the next year, where do you think we're going to make progress, and where do you think we should be focusing much more attention on?
Yeah, I think the biggest opportunity is investing in shared evidence infrastructure. So we stop paying repeatedly to relearn the same thing. So what could that shared infrastructure look like? We're starting because we're working on building, the various large language models for different organizations who are starting to implement it. As we build them their own LLMs, look at their own database, how can we then connect them too? How can we say, okay, UNICEF, World Food Program, German government, FCDO, how can you share so that, Red Cross, yes, it's great to look at your own data. Then you also need to bring in the local perspective. But if you're all programming in the same region because there's a famine, shouldn't you share data? And that is a huge challenge.
Is that possible? Would people be willing to share uncomfortable knowledge?
I think we start with the comfortable. That's good enough. First you have to understand your own data. Then you have to bring in others and bring in the local perspective. And so I think it is iterative. And honestly, sure, fine. Keep your sensitive data locked up. You can have a public and a private. You don't need to share everything. And the reality is it's not going to be shared always. But there's so much evidence that isn't damning, that is shareable, that we need to extract. And the reality is, yes, there's all this conversation about AI, how fast it's moving, but everybody still just has an unstructured database where they have reports piled without the metadata. So first they have to understand their own, and then we have to share it. And then we also need we are working with Global AI Commons that is creating an ethical AI certification. So for example, UNICEF is on the board, and they're contributing to look at how are we, when you're using AI with youth, how are you bringing in the youth perspective? Because let's be honest, the youth perspective is not represented, in these data sets. So creating a framework also with the biggest thinkers in this sector on how do we evaluate, how do we think about it, and having the shared understanding and the shared infrastructure. I mean, it's a huge project, but I think it's the way forward.
Well, you're doing fascinating work. This was such a pleasure speaking with you today, Lindsey. Thank you very much for coming on my show.
Thanks so much, Dan. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to In Pursuit of Development with Professor Dan Bannock from the University of Oslo. Please email your questions, comments and suggestions to inpursuitofdevelopment@gmail.com.